Canada is fighting back, and Trump's trade war just got a whole lot more complicated. While the world watches the ongoing tariff battles between Washington and Ottawa, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has just unveiled what might be the most comprehensive economic response to Trump's aggressive trade tactics we've seen yet. We're talking billions in funding, sweeping policy changes, and a complete restructuring of how Canada does business. It's not just defensive, it's transformative. So what exactly did Carney announce? And why is this response potentially game-changing for both countries? To understand the significance of what just happened, we need to recognize that the world has fundamentally changed around us.
The world is changing rapidly. The largest economy, the United States, is fundamentally reshaping all of its trading relationships. And we're moving from an age that lasted decades, an age when free trade was a motor of global economic growth, to a new age, an age of economic nationalism and mercantilism. You know, the U.S. tariff rate is now the highest it has been since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And these tariffs are being applied to all countries on nearly all goods. And the changes in U.S. policy go beyond tariffs. Countries now must in effect buy access to the world's largest economy through investments, through unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets. And all the while, the transformation of global trade is occurring against a backdrop of wider economic disruptions, of geopolitical realignment, of AI and other technological transformations, and the necessity, the imperative of a shift to a greener economy. What's going on is not a transition, it's a rupture. And its effect will be profound.
The era of free trade that defined the past several decades is giving way to economic nationalism and mercantilism. U.S. tariff rates have reached levels not seen since the Great Depression, with tariffs being applied to all countries on nearly all goods. This isn't just a transition, it's a rupture with profound effects including displaced workers, disrupted supply chains, and massive investment uncertainty that's slowing economic growth globally. But before we dive into what just happened, let's look at where Canada stood in this trade relationship.
Okay, well, let's go to results. Right now, we have the best trade deal of any country in the world. Okay, those are results. We think it can be better, and we're working to make it better. But to be absolutely clear, 85% of our trade with the United States is tariff-free. Nobody else is in that position. Our average tariff is about 5.5%. That's the lowest average tariff of any country in the world. So right now we have the best, but we have real issues. Without question, we have real issues in steel, in aluminum, in forest products, in autos, potentially in pharma, copper, some other sectors. So there's these strategic sectors that the U.S. has focused on where we have issues. And as well, there will be a review of CUSMA, our trade agreement with the U.S. and Mexico, starting next year. So we need to prepare for that. We need to lay the groundwork for that review, and we need to address as rapidly as possible these strategic sectors. Okay, so that's the overall context. So we're looking now, given that we've got the best deal, to really focus in on those strategic sectors and prepare the groundwork for that broader discussion on CUSMA.
Despite the tensions, Canada actually maintains one of the best trade positions with the United States. 85% of trade between the two countries remains tariff-free, and Canada faces the lowest average tariff from the U.S., at just 5.5% globally. Yet there are real challenges in strategic sectors: steel, aluminum, forest products, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and copper that have become flashpoints in this economic conflict. The relationship between Trump and Canada has been anything but smooth sailing. Since taking office for his second term, Trump has repeatedly targeted America's northern neighbor with escalating tariffs and increasingly hostile rhetoric. It started with the familiar playbook: steel and aluminum tariffs, fentanyl accusations, and threats that Canada should become the 51st state. But things have gotten progressively worse. By August 2025, Trump had ratcheted up tariffs on Canadian goods not covered under the USMCA trade agreement to a punishing 35%. His justification? The cross-border flow of fentanyl, despite data showing Canada accounts for only 1% of U.S. fentanyl imports. The reality is that Trump's tariff strategy has been designed to pressure Canada into submission. The pattern is clear: impose economic pain, demand concessions, and expect capitulation. For months, Canadian industries have been bleeding. Steel, aluminum, lumber, and automotive sectors have faced devastating impacts. Workers have been laid off, plants have scaled back production, and entire communities dependent on cross-border trade have watched their livelihoods evaporate. But here's where Trump's strategy may have backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing Canada to its knees, the pressure has created something far more dangerous for American interests: a unified, determined Canada with a comprehensive plan to reduce its economic dependence on the United States.
Any idea?
Well, sadly, I wasn't on the other line listening in like I used to do with my sisters back in the day, though I wish I were. But what I can tell you is a couple of things. First, I'm told by people behind the scenes that the fact that these conversations are happening is a good sign, right? They didn't for a while after that August 1st deadline came and went. And now we've seen two conversations basically within a week. So the fact that they're talking is perceived by people in and around the Prime Minister to be a good thing. Whether that translates into a good thing for Canadians is a whole other story. I take note of the Prime Minister's comments that the bulk of their discussion, I'm paraphrasing, but the bulk of their discussion focuses now on the sectoral tariffs. That is where, as cheesy as the saying is, the proof will be in the pudding, right? If, in essence, the Prime Minister is able to negotiate lower sectoral tariffs for Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, and copper, and in the auto sector, well, that will be the win that they are looking for. But the Trump administration has shown no signs of abating on those very, very punishing tariffs, and so we remain in a holding pattern. I garner from what the Prime Minister said that is where the focus of the conversations is right now. The fact they're talking is a good thing. Whether it translates into something better for those very, very hard-hit sectors is a whole different thing.
High-level discussions between Carney and Trump have continued, including a lengthy conversation covering trade, geopolitical issues, and labor matters. A senior Canadian delegation, led by the clerk of the Privy Council, has been in Washington meeting with U.S. counterparts. While these conversations show dialogue is happening, there's still no indication that the Trump administration will reduce the punishing tariffs on Canadian goods. The focus remains on sectoral tariffs affecting steel, aluminum, copper, and auto sector products. Enter Mark Carney's masterstroke. On Friday, speaking from Mississauga, Ontario, Carney didn't just announce a defensive response to Trump's tariffs. He unveiled what he called an economic strategy to move Canada from reliance to resilience, from uncertainty to prosperity. The scope is staggering. A $5 billion strategic response fund has been established to help Canadian businesses adapt and diversify their markets. This isn't just about weathering the storm, it's about fundamentally reshaping Canada's economic landscape. The fund will be open to all sectors because the tariff impacts are wide-ranging and affect industries across the board. But the Strategic Response Fund is just the beginning. Carney announced that the existing Regional Tariff Response Initiative, originally set up with $450 million to help small and medium-sized businesses, is being more than doubled to $1 billion. That's real money going directly to the businesses that have been hit hardest by Trump's trade war. Then there's the worker support package, and this is where things get really interesting. Up to 50,000 workers will be able to access new reskilling packages, helping them transition through training programs with their employers or recruitment companies. The government is extending employment insurance to 65 weeks for long-tenured workers, 20 weeks more than they currently get. The 1-week waiting period is being waived for as many as 700,000 workers. This isn't just about helping people survive the transition, it's about building a more skilled, adaptable workforce that can compete globally. Perhaps the most significant element of Carney's response is the comprehensive Buy Canadian policy. This represents a fundamental shift in how Canada approaches government procurement. For years, Canada has followed what Carney called outdated rules of a free trade order that no longer exists. Canadian taxpayer dollars have been flowing to foreign suppliers for short-term savings. No more. The new policy will prioritize Canadian businesses and products in government purchasing decisions. When you're talking about billions in government procurement spending, this creates an immediate, substantial market for Canadian companies. It's economic nationalism, but it's also smart policy in an era where free trade assumptions are being shattered by countries like the United States. Carney didn't stop there. The plan includes specific support for sectors that have been hammered by both U.S. and Chinese tariffs. The Canadian canola, beef, and seafood industries are getting targeted assistance, including more than $370 million in biofuel production incentives. These moves are designed to help domestic producers restructure their value chains and find new markets beyond the increasingly hostile U.S. market. There's even a notable concession to industry demands. The electric vehicle mandate is being paused for the 2026 model year, with a 60-day policy review. This might seem like a step backward on climate goals, but it's actually strategic. The auto industry has been one of the hardest hit by the trade war, and this pause gives companies breathing room to retool and adapt to the new economic reality. What makes this response so potentially devastating for Trump's strategy is that it's not just reactive, it's proactive. Carney isn't just trying to minimize damage from American tariffs. He's using the crisis as an opportunity to build a more resilient, self-sufficient Canadian economy. The Buy Canadian policy alone could redirect billions in spending away from American suppliers. The worker retraining programs could create a more competitive workforce. The Strategic Response Fund could spawn entirely new industries and markets. But here's the really clever part. Much of this is being positioned as a temporary response to Trump's unjustified trade actions. If and when trade relations normalize, Canada will have built new capabilities, new markets, and new economic structures that reduce its dependence on the United States. It's economic diversification disguised as crisis response. The timing couldn't be more significant. We're heading into a USMCA review in 2026, and Canada is building leverage. Instead of coming to the negotiating table as a supplicant begging for relief from American tariffs, Canada will arrive with a more diversified economy, stronger domestic industries, and reduced dependence on U.S. markets. That fundamentally changes the power dynamic. Trump's trade war was supposed to force Canada into submission. Instead, it may have accelerated Canada's economic independence from the United States. The numbers tell the story. Before Trump's latest tariff escalation, the U.S. average tariff rate on Canadian goods was already 5.6%. Still the lowest among all U.S. trading partners, but a significant burden nonetheless. Now with 35% tariffs on goods not covered by USMCA, entire sectors of the Canadian economy are being priced out of American markets. But rather than capitulating, Canada is saying, fine, we'll build our own markets. The agricultural support measures are particularly telling. Canada is investing heavily in biofuel production and marketing diversification to help farmers find new customers. If Canadian canola, beef, and seafood producers successfully pivot to Asian, European, or domestic markets, they become less vulnerable to future American trade tantrums. The worker support programs reveal another dimension of Carney's strategy. By investing heavily in reskilling and job matching, Canada is not just helping people survive the current crisis, it's building human capital for the post-Trump era. These workers will be more adaptable, more skilled, and more valuable in a global economy. The Strategic Response Fund is perhaps the most forward-looking element. $5 billion to help businesses develop new products and find new markets isn't just crisis management, it's industrial policy. Canadian companies that successfully use this funding to break into new markets or develop new capabilities won't necessarily come back to U.S. markets even if tariffs are lifted. From Trump's perspective, this has to be alarming. The whole point of the tariff strategy was to use economic leverage to force concessions from trading partners. But if those partners respond by building alternative economic structures, the leverage disappears. Worse, it creates long-term competitive disadvantages for American businesses. Canadian companies that develop new markets and capabilities during this period may become stronger competitors globally. American companies that have been protected by tariffs may find themselves less competitive when those protections are eventually removed. There's also a geopolitical dimension that Trump may not have fully considered. Canada's pivot away from economic dependence on the United States could strengthen ties with other partners, Europe, Asia, Latin America. A more economically independent Canada might be less willing to automatically align with American foreign policy priorities. The Buy Canadian policy is particularly significant in this context. Government procurement decisions often have strategic implications beyond pure economics. If Canada prioritizes domestic suppliers for defense, infrastructure, and technology purchases, it could affect everything from supply chain security to technological development. But perhaps the most important aspect of Carney's response is what it signals about Canadian resolve. This isn't a desperate attempt to appease Trump or minimize damage. It's a comprehensive strategy to build a stronger, more independent Canadian economy. The message is clear: Canada is not going to be bullied into submission. The response also reveals something important about the limits of economic coercion in the modern world. When Trump imposed tariffs, he probably expected Canada to quickly cave to pressure, as smaller economies often do when faced with restrictions from their largest trading partner. Instead, Canada is using the crisis as a catalyst for economic transformation. This could be a template for other countries facing similar pressure from larger powers. The worker support measures deserve special attention because they address one of the most politically sensitive aspects of trade wars. When industries get hit by tariffs, workers suffer immediately and visibly. By providing extended unemployment benefits, retraining opportunities, and job-matching services, Carney is ensuring that the human cost of Trump's trade war doesn't translate into political pressure for capitulation. Instead, workers are being given tools to adapt and thrive in a changing economy. The electric vehicle mandate pause might seem inconsistent with Canada's climate goals, but it's actually shrewd politics. The auto industry has been one of the loudest voices calling for relief from trade pressures. By giving them this concession while simultaneously providing billions in support for retooling and adaptation, Carney is buying industry support for his broader strategy. The biofuel production incentives are particularly clever because they serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They help agricultural sectors hit by tariffs, advance climate goals, and reduce dependence on imported energy. It's the kind of policy that creates multiple constituencies for support while advancing strategic objectives. What's really striking about this response is how it reframes the entire trade conflict. Instead of accepting the narrative that Canada is a victim of necessary American trade corrections, Carney is positioning this as Canada choosing economic independence over continued dependence on an unreliable partner. That's a powerful political message domestically, but it's also strategic positioning internationally. Looking ahead, the success of this strategy will depend on execution and timing. Can Canadian businesses actually use the Strategic Response Fund to successfully develop new markets? Will the worker retraining programs actually help people transition to new careers? Can the Buy Canadian policy be implemented without creating inefficiencies or retaliation from other trading partners? But even if some elements don't work perfectly, the overall approach represents a fundamental shift in how middle powers can respond to economic coercion from larger neighbors. Instead of accepting dependence as inevitable, countries can use external pressure as motivation for building more resilient, diversified economies. For Trump, this creates a serious strategic problem. The tariff strategy was supposed to give the United States leverage over trading partners. But if those partners respond by reducing their dependence on American markets, the long-term result could be a less influential America in global trade. The timing of Carney's announcement is also significant. We're approaching the USMCA review, and both sides are positioning for those negotiations. Canada is essentially saying we're prepared to be less dependent on the U.S. market. So American negotiators shouldn't assume they can extract major concessions through economic pressure. This could fundamentally change the dynamics of those talks. The response also sends a message to other American allies facing similar pressures. Mexico, European countries, and Asian partners are all watching to see how Canada handles Trump's trade aggression. If Canada's strategy succeeds in building economic resilience without triggering devastating retaliation, it could become a model for other countries. From an American business perspective, this should be concerning. Canadian companies that successfully diversify their markets during this period may become less reliable customers for American suppliers. Canadian workers who develop new skills may become more competitive globally. A more economically independent Canada may be less willing to accept American products and services automatically. The Buy Canadian policy alone could redirect billions in government spending away from American suppliers. Over time, that creates competitive advantages for Canadian companies and supply chains that don't necessarily disappear when trade tensions ease. But perhaps most importantly, Carney's response reveals the limitations of Trump's transactional approach to international relations. By treating allies as economic competitors to be pressured rather than partners to be cultivated, Trump may be accelerating the decline of American economic influence globally. Countries that might have remained willingly dependent on American markets are being forced to build alternatives. The comprehensive nature of Carney's plan suggests this isn't a temporary adjustment, it's a permanent restructuring of Canada's economic strategy. The worker retraining programs will create lasting human capital. The Strategic Response Fund will spawn new industries and capabilities. The Buy Canadian policy will create new domestic supply chains. Even if tariffs are eventually lifted, these changes will persist. This is exactly the kind of outcome that Trump's trade strategy was supposed to prevent. Instead of making America's trading partners more dependent and compliant, it's making them more independent and competitive. The irony is that Trump's tariffs may end up achieving the opposite of their intended effect. Not a more submissive Canada, but a more economically independent one that's less susceptible to future American economic pressure. Time will tell whether Carney's strategy succeeds in building the economic resilience he promises. But what's already clear is that this represents a fundamental shift in how middle powers can respond to economic coercion from larger neighbors. Instead of accepting subordination as inevitable, countries can use external pressure as motivation for building stronger, more independent economies. For Trump, that has to be a deeply troubling development. The whole premise of his trade strategy was that economic dependence would translate into political leverage. But if trading partners respond by building economic independence, that leverage disappears and may never return.